or discussions that you'd like to open up to the panel, that's going to be very useful. And maybe at the end we'll come back and have a bit of some closing thoughts from the three panelists. And we should be done, or we have to be done within the hour, because then we continue with the plenary talks. So should we just get started? If we go by alphabetical order, Chris, that would be you to start. Do you want to introduce yourself and kick us off?
I thought Jackson would be far enough down the list. I'd always get to go sort of in the middle, but maybe not. Yes, I'm happy to go first. Thank you so much for the invitation from Mark and the organisers to come to your meeting, and also to Mark for chairing this session. Hopefully you can see my slide there. So it's just 5 minutes sort of introduction to me to hopefully precipitate some discussion later on. So my name is Chris Jackson. My pronouns are he, him, his. I thought it'd be useful just to say a bit about my background. So here's me on the left, that's my big brother on the right. And I was born in the industrial town of Derby in the East Midlands of England, a very, very white town of, or small city now of around 250,000 people. This is me with my family, my brother there to my left, who's a postman, and my mum and dad, who were both nurses. My dad was from St. Vincent, my mum was from Jamaica. Both immigrants in the late 60s, end of the Windrush generation. So I was a first generation university attendee, as well as being Black. And I think this aspect, or this idea of intersectionality, is an important theme throughout probably what we're all going to talk about today. We have many different identities. I went to a local community state school. This was its Ofsted score a couple of years ago. As you can see, it got well below average. And it was one of the worst ranked state schools in the whole of the UK. It's not got much better. It's gone into academy status now. So again, that's principally because this school drew from a very socioeconomically disadvantaged area in Derby. And again, that's again to highlight this issue of intersectionality. You know, being Black and then attending a school like this and being first gen, you know, there are similarities in the experiences I've had with white working class people, for example. So, and part of that is really important to my identity, because I do then, I hope I'm then able to recognise and support people who don't look like me, but have had similar lived experiences to what I have had. Having gained exit velocity from Derby, I attended the University of Manchester to study geology, undergraduate and PhD. And then I went to Norway, to the city of Bergen, to work for an energy company. So I did rig work and various other things, applying research that I did during my PhD. I eventually, that was in 2002, I finished my PhD, and in 2004, I returned back to an academic position at Imperial College on the top left here, where I was for 16 years until February last year, where I then returned back to the University of Manchester for a professorship there. So I'm a geologist. What do? I look at the Earth, I try and understand how it deforms, how rocks are deposited on and within the Earth, and trying to apply that knowledge to the betterment of society through the locating and extraction of resources. Being a Black professor in geosciences means you're a bit of a unicorn. Being a Black professor in any subject within UK higher education is quite rare. As you can see in this graphic here, there are about 22,000 professors in the UK higher education, and only 0.74% of those are Black. And I think that number's actually fallen this year with the resignation of some Black professors, both men and women. Well, yeah, there's just been a decrease in the number of Black professors. So that means that, you know, you're quite rare in your discipline. You're incredibly, there's only 2 Black geoscience professors, by the way. And you're quite rare in higher education in general. But having said that, I think we still should think about the elements of privilege we do have. Okay, so I'm a man, right, and I identify as a man, and that confers upon me some privileges that people who are not men may not have. Okay, so I still need to recognise that my journey has been substantially supported by luck, privilege, and circumstance and happenstance. And I think, you know, having that awareness is important for all of us. Just a trigger warning, content warning for the next couple of slides. There is racist language on one of them, but I'm going to use it to highlight a point, hopefully, that's important. Despite being a professor and despite having you know, whatever prestige that confers on you, you're still subject to discrimination. I attended Stanford a couple of years ago at their request with a fully paid journey out to Stanford to give a talk, and I was twice during that trip mistaken for a PhD student, despite the fact I'm an old man. So, you know, like the first thing people still see about you is that you're Black, and then they don't see anything else beyond that, which in some ways is good because you shouldn't be treated any differently if you're a professor, but it certainly speaks to the stereotyping that people would have, not just at Stanford, but probably in the academic sphere in general. It gets worse than that. You get overt racism like this, where people shout and scream at you in the streets. And this is the, you know, kind of want to make this point in here. You know, Kanye West's lyric from All Falls Down, you know, and his comment there is interesting because what it essentially says to me is you can't educate your way out of racism. Okay, you can achieve things, you can win prizes, you can write papers, you can win money, and you can develop your identity in a classically academic way, but still your Blackness defines often how people interact with you, both in the street in Australia, as this slide highlights, but also even in incredibly professional spheres, such as a departmental invited talk visit on the other side of the world. So that's it from me. You know, why do we do this sorts of stuff? It's always emotionally quite challenging to talk about yourself and to talk about things like we're going to do in the Q&A, but I think it's worth it for the future because we're trying to improve access and opportunity across a number of different number of different historically excluded groups. And these are my daughters in the back of my car, and you know, I talk to them regularly about in fact all of the things we're going to talk about today, because I think it's important for them to be aware of what the futures could be like and how to be prepared to challenge some of the things in it. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was really interesting. I think the best thing is if we just go straight through to our other two panelists, and then we will have the audience participation after that. So with that, we can go to Clara.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Brilliant, thanks. So I don't have slides, I'm afraid, so it's a quick introduction from me. So my name is Clara Nellist. I actually did my PhD at Manchester, so I was very sad. Oh, I can see myself big now. Remove it for me. Just so I can see your lovely faces too. Yeah, I did my PhD at the University of Manchester, so I was very sad that I wasn't coming back this week. It would have been nice to visit in person. So I'm a Radboud Excellence Initiative Fellow in the Netherlands. I've also done postdocs in France and Germany, so I've moved around quite a lot during my career. And today I'm representing both gender and LGBTQ. So I am the Atlas D&I contact, one of the Atlas D&I contacts. I'm on the faculty board at my university for women faculty, and I am the chair of LGBTQ CERN. So those are the hats that I'm wearing today. And there's so much that I want to talk about in terms of these issues, and so I think I'll just pass over and then we can discuss them in the Q&A.
Okay, thanks a lot, Clara. So then our third panelist is Giordon Stark. So Giordon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, yes, we hear you.
Excellent. Well, I have been involved in the Atlas experiment, but I grew up in Florida as the only pretty much deaf physicist in the world. I have a PhD in particle physics, and I'm the only deaf person that has that. There are 3 deaf physicists in general, but I'm the only American. Then there is a German and a Swede as well. And I have several different hats, just like Clara does. And I am an early career on the early career scientist board, and I'm more of involved in the DEI group as well, and I focus on 2 different things. One being physical access for physicists, meaning both deaf and just in general, such as like blind, visual access, wheelchair access as well, but also early access for early career scientists as well. And I will also hold most of what I would like to say for the Q&A and hand off at this point. Also won't be sharing any slides.
Thanks a lot, Giordon. So that brings us to the end of the introductions of our three panelists. So we are open to questions from anyone in the audience, or if anyone on the panel wants to talk about something in particular or raise a theme or point of discussion, then please go ahead. So I see Pedro has his hand raised. Please go ahead, Pedro.
Hello, everybody. Well, I'll show my face. So I'm Pedro Abreu from Lisboa, Portugal. I would like to know if any of you, at this point today, I know that history is a heavy history for all of you, but do you still feel discriminated between your colleagues or among your colleagues? Do you feel that your colleagues discriminate you in a bad way?
Chris, do you want to go first?
Sorry, you go first, Clara.
I mean, I can give a very specific example. So it's very difficult to know when if you're being discriminated against, or when. Sometimes it's so subtle that you don't actually realize it. You cannot tell whether it would be the same for colleagues with different backgrounds. But I've been directly told that a position that I was applying for, somebody spoke against recommending me for the position, specifically because I spoke out on women's issues in physics. And so there are direct examples I have that my career, it didn't necessarily stop me for that position, but it's an example of a scientist who felt that me speaking about the number of women in physics was strong enough of a negative that I should not be recommended for that position.
So, but just to clarify, Clara, in that case, you were discriminated by the policies or the discussions you were having, not because of being a woman, but because you were taking stands or defending your positions or accusing, or it was because you were a woman. I mean, would the men defending the same positions also be discriminated? Is that what you feel?
Again, it's very difficult to know exactly, but in this specific case, I was attending a talk at CERN about a paper that had come out about the number of women in physics or in science in general. And I asked the editor a very simple question that I would ask for a physics paper as well, which was that the referees had recommended this paper not for publication. It had been published anyway. There was an outcry about the scientific methods of this paper. And I asked the editor, what would they do next? How would they react to this paper? And if this had been about physics, I feel that I would have been thought of well. But because I was asking about a paper about the number of women in physics, I was, quote, labeled a troublemaker. When I was asking about the scientific content. And I do feel that if I have no evidence, but I feel that if a man was asking the same question, they would not get labeled the same.
Thank you.
Should we move to our other panelists? Giordon, where are you?
Yeah, I actually have several different examples, but I could think of a few off the top of my head, but they were all kind of microaggressions. One example is that when I was involved with when I am involved with the Atlas experiment and being invited to various conferences, they often are a little bit last minute as far as getting access. And so it is really a challenge to get conference information like a month or two in advance. so that I can get qualified interpreters for the conferences. And so those invitations happen maybe with 3 weeks notice, and that's just not enough time to be able to make all the arrangements needed to be able to go to a conference. Another example is with outreach videos. So sometimes there are, live YouTube videos that are not appropriately captioned. And I'm not actually able to understand the things that are being said in the live YouTube videos. And there's just no access in general for those type of things. And we keep, I've pushed CERN and LHC to improve the access for all types of media.
Thanks, Giordon. Chris, you had your hand raised as well on this one.
Yeah, I think to Pedro's point, I think what we need to bear in mind that there are many different manifestations of discrimination, right? So let's take the case of Black people. Often when we think about anti-Black discrimination, often we'll be thinking about very overt forms of that. So name calling, physical assault, but actually racism or any form of discrimination is actually saturated within many of the structures we have. They're the way in which we select people for positions, or not in Clara's case. It's the way in which we promote people. It's the way in which we design things, as Giordon's getting to here, or how we relate to people, or take into account their specific requirements in a timely fashion that allows them to take part in something that everybody else can. So I think discrimination has lots of different forms. So it's very important to listen to people in historically excluded groups and then realize, that there are a number of these different ways. I think the other point I would make as well is I think in academia and in research centres and amongst the educated classes, quote unquote, we like to think of ourselves as very progressive and liberal. But I would argue that I think many of these institutions are just sampling from broader society. There's no reason there should be less discriminatory people within academic or research institutions or amongst educated classes than there should be across any other bit of society. So I do find often when we talk about these things, as Clara found out when she spoke out, whether that's discrimination against her because she's a woman, or it's discrimination against her because she had a more progressive viewpoint to challenge the status quo, both of those things are a problem because we're probably not as open-minded as we would like to be.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And also following on from that point, there, just also to bring in LGBTQ, there are specific examples, even at CERN, of direct homophobia that has happened on site. And there are, Chris mentioned access issues about, and Giordon was also talking about access issues for conferences. Some conferences are located in countries where it is illegal to be gay or to be a trans person. And we have very little protection for our colleagues who would like to speak at those conferences, which may be very important for their career progression, but cannot because it is a country where it risks their personal safety to even go to these conferences.
Thank you.
So do we want to have any more follow-ups on that, or should we go to another audience question? I see Tama has their hand raised.
Yeah, hi. Actually, yeah, this topic is very interesting, especially for me, for example, because I, like with my religion, I'm a Muslim. I worked in different countries, actually, from China, Switzerland, Germany, and US a little bit. I have to admit that I haven't seen that much discrimination, or let me say direct discrimination in my life, in my academic life, so to say. But I don't know, but I want to share this with you because I think you guys, I think that direct discrimination is much easier than indirect discrimination, because at least indirect discrimination, when someone tells you something directly, you can take an action and you have support in this. But in direct discrimination, that okay, you know, like, well, these are the rules. I mean, you haven't got this job because, well, it depends on the CV. You got this feeling, or your friends are not with you. I mean, they are not going to lunch with you. I mean, they have full freedom to not go with you, you know. And this actually is one of the hardest parts that I say or I see in this kind of discrimination, especially in the scientific academic way. So I don't know what's your opinion about this.
Chris, please just go ahead.
All right, sorry, I was waiting for the nod. Yeah, you're completely right, Tamir. I think it goes back to what Clara started off saying, is sometimes it's quite hard to work out why something is happening to you. And it's not just hard, it's incredibly tiring, because you're constantly on the lookout and you don't want to become oversensitive because you don't want to react poorly, or you don't want to react to every single thing because, you know, sometimes it might not be a discriminatory act against you, and it's just tiring to try and do that processing. I think the danger comes when there is an act which is definitely discriminatory, and yeah, you can't work out whether it's that bad because, like you say, there's no evidence, or somebody didn't write it down, or there was no bystanders to witness that act, because then it's just you, your head, and the perpetrator to try and, you know, there's evidence, if you will, for what happened. Yeah, I don't know what else to say really, but it's probably the worst thing about. In some ways, if somebody just pushed me over in the street and shouted a word at me, or said go away in a message and wrote something, then it'd be easy to deal with. But not all manifestations of discrimination are so clear.
Yeah, I completely agree with Chris. I mean, sometimes I just wish obviously you don't want the overt stuff, but it would be, as you just said, Chris, it's just easier to know then and not have to second guess everything, and wonder whether or not there was some behind meaning to something.
Yeah, this actually is the killing thing. This thinking, this behind thinking, like you are sleeping and you don't know, like, how should I do this? Like, should I take it serious or not? Or like, yeah, this exactly is the thing, that this prevents you from sleeping actually. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just give you an example because it is very, 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 very topical. So I'm involved in a I can't say too much, but I'm involved in a process which is exactly related to this time here, where something happened to me and it took me a while to work out exactly what the meaning of it was. And then reporting that is very, very painful because it involves a lot of analysis yourself and by other people as to what this act meant and what the person, because it's a difference, right, between what they meant by an act versus what the impact is. And I think, again, we have to try and disaggregate those two things. I don't care if you're a nice person, what you did was problematic. And that doesn't make you a terrible person, but what it does is it gives you an opportunity to reflect on your action and then to use that to, you know, build a better you, if you want to put it that way. So I'm kind of currently going through that situation, and it is really, you hope that the outcome of those processes are a learning experience for everybody. You know, you realize that your feelings of hurt were justified, and the person who perpetrated that realizes that their actions were damaging.
I see Martha raised her hand. Do you have a question or something to discuss, Martha?
Hi, yeah. It was about the topic that you were discussing about this kind of overt discrimination or sexism or racism, etc., versus the kind of subtle, everyday kind of thing. I think both are important, and but kind of discussing the subtle ones and saying, oh, but it's only these small things and there's not really any overt sexism nowadays, is there? Is not true, because there is. It's not, look, we just get these kind of subtle things. It's like we actually do get these overt sexist and racist, etc. things. Like I've told some of my colleagues this before. I've literally been told to my face in my office, if you don't like the fact that there's not women in physics, then go and do something else then, and that women are wired differently, and that's why they don't do physics. And that's very obviously sexist, right? It's not like we're just it's not like we just have these kind of under the carpet subtle things, is kind of what I was saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Thank you.
Janina, did you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to raise 2 points here. And I think one is that, so I'm a PhD student, so I'm quite early in my career. And it's always hard to speak up about this stuff, especially if you are young in the career and you definitely depend on the not well-being, but the opportunity to get help from older colleagues. And let's face it, a lot of our older colleagues are male. So if you call out someone, it's sometimes hard because it can negatively reflect back on you, even if you don't want to. And this is definitely an issue. And we try to have, let's say, places where you can go and report this kind of stuff that is independent of this in place to protect not only women, but especially other minorities in our field. But I think, especially if it comes to follow-ups, there is always a point where sometimes there is some kind of coming together or having a discussion. So it's kind of hard. And especially if you are a person from a minority, it's quite easy to figure out who might be the person that was initiating this. So I think this is also something which we always need to keep in mind. And for example, is my experience as a female person in physics is that there are often situations where even I, at an early stage of my career, have to listen to the point of other colleagues that I got a certain position or certain job just because I'm female and they need to fulfill a quota. And that is quite annoying because I always feel I have to prove myself just because I'm female, and I have this kind of doubt in my qualities that I need to overcome. And I'm certain this is not just for females in physics, but also for other minorities. And I think that's kind of sad because I feel that kind of pressure, which comes on top of everything, makes life much more difficult and to stay in science. And maybe that's the reason why we also push people out of the field, because of this constant need to prove ourselves, just because we don't look like the majority, just because we are not male physicists. And I think that's sad and we need to address that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And going on your first point, I think it's really important why we need allies and we need people who are in positions of power or look like the majority, who can say something with less repercussions. So the example I gave at the beginning of the session, I know that there were senior men who spoke up at the comment that was made about me, and their feedback was so important to be able to knock back that comment. And then at the second point you made about, yeah, just about it being, sorry, I've lost my thread, but I'll come back when I remember it.
Maybe about the topic of being just a quota of women to fulfill the quota of gender equality in some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, it also creates, like, I agree, it creates a lot of worry for me because I feel like I have to be better because anytime I fail, I'm just proving that women aren't as good. And so I can't just, there's a fantastic XKCD comic that completely explains this. There's a cartoon stick man that's doing maths and somebody's like, haha, you're bad at maths. And then there's a cartoon stick woman that's doing maths and they say, look, women are bad at maths. So you don't get to fail as an individual. You fail the the group that you represent, which is a lot of extra pressure to put on people who are also underrepresented and don't have necessarily the networks in the career structures.
I think Giordon, do you want to go next? Do you want to reply to that?
I can think of different situations that have come up where it feels like maybe it's not overt rather. So when I've had like Atlas meetings and I'm, working with my colleagues, and because I can't hear everything, I don't know when is a good time to interrupt, which means that I'm always waiting for a lull when someone is not speaking and looking at the captioning and seeing a bit of a delay, maybe 3-4 minutes. So I'm not always able to interrupt at an appropriate time, and I'm always worried about that. And I know that I, look like a straight white man in physics, and I don't want to be that person talking over a woman or talking over a minority. So I worry about that as well. And, I've realized that worrying about those things become what really is the main worry is that I'm a deaf person in a hearing world. And all of the adaptations that you have to do where you work, or instead of trying to change the structure itself. So those are the types of barriers that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, I was just going to, I don't forgot what, I just going to come back to Martha's points about the variety of incidents, if you will. I think one thing that's always struck me is the amount of underreporting around these things. So whenever I've got in conflict with people who want to argue that discrimination doesn't exist, it's inevitably white men, who say, give me some data, show me a graph, prove to me this happens, when, give me an example. And you do, or you point to the broader demographics of geoscience or physics. You say, look, do you think this is representative of society at large? No, and they may try and give you an extra reason, but women aren't wired to do physics, or women don't like standing in mountains looking at rocks. That's why there's an underrepresentation of women. They might try and argue that point. But then there's also this underrepresentation issue, right? All of these discriminatory practices or acts are not being reported by these historically excluded groups. So you can't even point to those data and say, or you can, but it might look quite modest. And it might seem like there's not a problem, but historically excluded groups are not well known for coming forward and challenging the status quo, because it can leave them in manifest danger. It puts them in a very precarious, and early career research is the same, going to Janine's point about raising issues. You have to be incredibly brave / stupid to do that in some instances, which is why it's so important for senior people and people with more privilege to take the lead on, going to Clara's point about allyship, take the lead on that reporting and take the lead on providing mechanisms for people to report anonymously and therefore safely. That's going to be something that's super important as we try and change the culture we live in at the moment.
So I see Jean has had a hand up for a while.
Yeah, to be honest, I think Chris has just touched on it a bit, but I wondered if the panel could say anything about anonymous reporting and how to make that work, because I kind of have a worry that, if as an ally you think you might have seen something, but you're not sure because it's not direct, discrimination, it's subtle, and you report it, maybe you never hear anything back. And I think as a community we need to make anonymous reporting mechanisms work, and I can't quite get my head around the best way to do that.
Maybe I can. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. No, please go.
No, go, Clara.
Okay, thanks. So I was just going to say, as with one of my hats as the Atlas DNI, or one of the Atlas DNI contacts, we have an anonymous reporting box, and there were some concerns, and I know that people in the audience who had this position before, that some concerns were voiced that people would use it to spread rumors or it would be misused. And actually, we just see very little reporting. But the option is there for people to use. And even if no action can be taken from a report, it's very useful to have that data, as Chris was saying about having statistics and being able to point to something, especially aggregated data to be able to say, look, there were this many incidences and it's important. And that's why we need to have this safeguarding. We need to have this set up to support certain groups. And so just maybe I would use this opportunity to just really encourage people that if you feel like there's something that should be reported, it's very useful to even anonymously make sure the right structures know about it.
As we've been discussing, I guess there's a broad spectrum of ways in which people can be targeted by discrimination and things like this. Some of them seem suitable for reporting. Some of them, I don't know how you would even report it. As we've said, it's often things that you might not even know that have happened. But yeah, it sounds like keeping track of these incidents is no bad thing.
If I can come in, oh no, go ahead. No, it is definitely your turn.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's two things there, right? One is reporting of incidents and individuals. The other one is constant monitoring of systems that are problematic, right? I think in some respects we've made more progress in being self-critical enough that we're happy to report people or incidents. But actually, the thing I found hardest in my sort of activism, if you will, is trying to convince people that the structure within which they work and have helped uphold is problematic. That's the thing which seems hardest to change. Is people to have enough self-reflection of something which is like systems and processes are quite what's the word, abstract. I'm in a room with physicists here. I'm probably going to use the wrong words, but they're kind of, you can't see them, and they sort of have always worked, quote unquote. So people don't want to challenge them, but actually we need to have that that awareness and that hyper awareness, if you want, about every single bit of the process and systems we're using to select people, promote people, reward people, and act appropriately when we see something incorrect to change it.
Yeah, perhaps I can jump in with a quick example of also just systematic structures that are not supporting everybody appropriately. So for example, for transgender colleagues, it's only just now becoming possible to change names on past publications in order that people who have transitioned can protect the identity that they are trans. Not everybody wants to be out at work. They want to be they want to be seen as the gender they are and not have to go through that discussion with every single colleague. And so being able to keep their past scientific publications and body of work, which is so important for career progression, and not have to out themselves at every single instance is something that we could do better, that we could introduce measures to make sure that people can transition and keep their scientific history as well without putting themselves potentially in danger.
Should we take another question from the audience? I see, is it Giordon? You've had your hand up for a while. Sorry if I massacred your name.
Yes, hi. Actually, I wanted to bring to the discussion another less noticeable minority group, which is the neurodivergent people. For example, I am autistic, and it's not something that you can tell simply by looking at my face, but still I have a lot of experiences, especially in the academic world, that are probably very different from neurotypical scientists, even though, to be honest, we have a lot of autistic scientists, but still similar to what Giordon was saying, that he is deaf in a world where everybody hears. Being autistic, you have to adapt to the way everybody else around you think and speak and behave. So I just wanted to bring this to the discussion, see if anybody else has any experience with that, if there is any other autistic person in here.
Maybe I can just come in very quickly and say that I think this is really important. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know that, for example, CERN is wanting in the next year to have more focus on neurodiversity, or something nearly fell on the shelf. And I would encourage, if you feel comfortable, if you're working at CERN, to maybe, and you can ask me for the link for the email address, the diversity officer at CERN is interested in having more feedback about how CERN can improve support for neurodiverse colleagues. So I don't really have any concrete support or suggestions right now, but I think it's something that we should definitely be talking about more. So thank you for bringing it up.
That's nice to know. I'm not working at CERN, but I can give some information if you want.
I mean, if you'd like to pass it on to me, and I can forward it on and sometimes it helps that perhaps if CERN makes these improvements, then it can help to influence other institutes to do the same. So if that's useful, I don't want to ask you to spend your time on something if it's not, it's extra work, but if you want to, you can contact me.
Yes, sure.
I see Ava has her hand raised.
I was actually gonna say that I'm actually quite interested in hearing how we can support autistic people better. So if you want to comment now, I'd be interested to hear.
Yes, so I think it's a bit hard to explain because I think we are usually interpreted in two ways. Either people expect us to be like a human computer and be able to answer everything immediately, be a super genius, things like that, or people are surprised that we look and act normal. Like I don't speak in a stereotypical way, so people sometimes don't really believe or understand that I am autistic, yes, but I can interact with other people in a non-stereotypical way. So these are the things that are, I think, that I notice when I mention to people, but also in the academia, for example, for autistic people, we usually have some like obsessions. So we get very obsessed with something and do all we can, spend all our time and resources with some subject. For example, if I am feeling now obsessed with my research, I will be extremely productive and I will do everything super fast. But sometimes it's the opposite. We simply can't concentrate on that. And for exams, for example, this is extremely challenging because if you're not if you're not like in the mood to do an exam, sometimes we can get stuck and read again and again the question without getting anywhere. And these are things that it's hard really to deal with because you have to do the exam together with everybody else on the same day as everybody else, with the same time as everybody else, but sometimes you're gonna finish the exam half the time and sometimes you need twice the time because it really depends how you are, how you're feeling that day. So I think these are the most important things that I can think right now.
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, the Bluetooth just died on my mouse. Yeah, no, I've learned quite a lot about, in particular, autism just by having a friend who is autistic, who's spent a lot of time kind of talking to me about various issues as relates to their inclusion in geosciences. And what, one real big learning for me was that autism manifests in so many different ways. And, often people have that kind of Rain Man stereotype in their head where there's one expression of, firstly, there's one expression of autism, and it is that this person's a genius, right? And that's just wrong factually, but it's also damaging if that's the picture you have in your head when you're going into an interaction or you're interacting with somebody who is autistic. So that was one really important reckoning for me. The other thing was I posted some references in the chat that might be useful, but it was then like practical guides how people with autism, how their enjoyment or their engagement with field geology, going out into the hills and doing that sort of thing, how that experience could be improved for them by modifications to the timetable of the field work, the amount of information that's given to people, when that information about when we're leaving on the coach, when we're coming back on the coach. It was really like practical guides, because there are people who do want to make progress in certain areas, but they just don't know how. And what they need to do is listen to people who can tell them that, like Clara said, if people have the time and energy to share their experiences with people, if they're goodwill, they'll take that on board and create systems which are more appropriate or will allow a better experience to be had by a broader group of people. So yeah, hopefully those references are useful that I've posted there.
Thank you.
So I wonder, one of the themes that came up a few times this morning was the problem in underrepresentation, is something that you mentioned, Chris. And I'm wondering if there's anything specific which we could use to address this in the hiring process, for example. I've sat in a few hiring panels recently, and of course you're always asked to sit through diversity training, and I wonder if that's the most effective approach. Obviously, it's an important facet of it, but without changing the actual structure of the hiring process, is making people go through diversity training going to have the positive impact that we need? In fact, I read a study which indicated that diversity training had actually stopped having an impact because people just assumed because they'd done the training, they were now free from unconscious bias.
Yeah, I think that is a problem, that people think that you take one course and then there's no bias anymore, so everything's fine. There are some great studies for, not necessarily for hiring, but for grant applications, that when you properly remove identifying information from grant applications, that there is a significantly higher success rate amongst underrepresented groups. And I think there's a lot we can learn from those kind of examples of how we could then apply it to hiring structures as well.
Yeah, there was one around telescope access, wasn't there, recently, which was, I think it was maybe NSF, I'm not sure, but yeah, that seemed like a really important outcome from that study, is that we obviously, with the best will in the world, we're still bringing with us a bunch of bias that is meaning that we're assessing whether somebody went to University X or not, and whether they knew my mate who I used to drink with at this conference all the time. And there's lots of soft biases that creep, well, not so soft, but lots of biases that creep in. And yeah, I think one natural answer to that point, Mark, is that we need to have representation from underrepresented groups on these different committees and panels. But then we become we get in a bit of a, this is something I was talking about today to NCAS, but we end up then asking those groups to do a lot more work than we do with people in the majority, because then they're tasked with reading 400 CVs or whatever it might be, or we need this black person because we've got one black person, so let's put this black person on the committee so we can show people we've got a black person. Then we can say that the process was completely non-discriminatory as pertains to race, but that means that that one black person will be on every single committee. So it is tricky. I think allyship is the only way to train, I think just training the majority to be better people would be good, is the best way of doing it.
Yeah, and then also just to jump on what Chris was saying, we don't always find that people from underrepresented groups are always less biased than the general population, and there is sometimes an experience, if I'm talking about women in physics, that it was very difficult for women who went through, who were becoming physicists in sort of the 70s or 80s, and then they don't think that sort of all these microaggressions count as any discrimination because they had overt sexism all the time, and therefore the sort of empathy and support then for the next generation of the underrepresented group, it doesn't necessarily guarantee. What I'm trying to say is that having somebody from an underrepresented group will just fix things. There does have to be much more structure set in place as well. And just really clear, especially for hiring, really clear criteria of what is required. But also we need to get rid of this whole excellence, and we need the very, very best candidate, because we have so many fantastic candidates in physics that I know that there are positions where more people have applied that are fantastic for the job than can even be interviewed. And then the selection process becomes very difficult. And if you just go for excellence, then these biases are where it creeps in. I'm not saying that we should, I'm having to be maybe a bit careful here, because then I'm going to get criticism, which I sometimes get on Twitter, that we have to sacrifice excellence for diversity. And that's absolutely not true. But some of these words that are used will influence biases within the selection process, because they seem like very objective criteria, but actually it's excellence is such a subjective thing. And how do you define it?
I mean, Giordon, just to your cartoon you popped in the chat there. I mean, one good example of that is, you know, I've only done one interview round for a faculty position in the US, but it was exactly as that cartoon suggests. Come here for 4 days, meet 40 people from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, have 1 hour back in your hotel, then you're going to go out 3 hours every night with faculty or students to have dinner. And it's just, you know, there's a one-size-fits-all hiring process, which isn't designed for your equity bit of your cartoon, Giordon, where you would then say, okay, we're going to do something which makes actually the process less terrible, but then there's going to be specific candidates who will benefit from that kind of structure we have in place being tailored to their and like goes to your point, Giordon, about the sufficient warning about how you can put in place, you know, things that you would need. So you need sufficient warning about, you know, something happening like a meeting or an interview that you could actually engage, bring your full self to it, Giordon.
Marco?
Yeah, I was wondering what you were thinking about sort of actions to take in terms of career progression. So for instance, there are specific career paths. I'm thinking of the Royal Society Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship in the UK, which is a fellowship that targets specific groups with, for example, care needs, but not exclusively. It's a fellowship that is following the same selection process as the headline fellowship that's open to everyone, and gives you the same amount of money, the same amount of access. It is, however, in my experience, from talking to people in the university hierarchy, not seen as equally prestigious, and therefore does not lead to long-term positions as the flagship fellowship that is open to white male scientists leads on to. So I was wondering what your take was on these specific earmarked pathways that intend to give people better access, but inevitably come with this sort of tag to it of having gotten this alternative route, which is still extremely competitive, of course.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, it's like with conditional offers for university, right? That's been just talked about recently. You know, do we have conditional offers? So rather than asking for straight A's, we give it a 2A and a B offer because this person comes from a certain polar, you know, grouping. So from a certain socioeconomic section. So we're going to give them a conditional offer. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need these things. But at the moment, we're in such deep, I won't swear, we're in such deep doo-doo. I do think that these things are valuable. I think we then need to change the culture of how we value them. Because as you said, Marco, those, you know, the Dorothy Hodgkin fellowships or the L'Oreal fellowships are still hugely competitive. And, you know, I think the generational change we need in our university leadership, at least, which we thought would bring us to a point where we were basically more accepting of these things as being equally as prestigious as these other things. I'm not sure if that's going to come, because I think the systems are just being picked up by the next generation and used, and we need to still keep fighting to make it clear that those things are just as important. I don't know if anybody else thinks similarly or different.
I think however you do this, people from minority groups are always going to be accused of getting where they are because they're a minority, right? Even if they get the prestigious fellowship, people could turn around and say, well, you got that, or that lectureship, or that PhD studentship. I think it's something that we will always have to fight against, this perception that we're filling quotas.
Which also, if I just say very quickly, is so frustrating. I mean, I have been told directly to my face that I will have it easier finding a permanent position because I am a woman in physics. And that has not been my experience. And these extra fellowship opportunities or other systems that are put in place are to counteract the ongoing systemic structures throughout a person's career that are causing certain groups to not be able to advance as quickly. And to then be told that you'll have an easier time because you're from a minoritized group is extremely frustrating. It's very dismissive of the things that you have to go through.
One thing I did ask somebody once on a panel very similar to this was, I was like, how many white cis het men on the call would like to swap places with any of the panelists? And that kind of drew silence from across the board, of course, because nobody would want to do that, of course, right?
We're getting towards the end of the hour. I see, Pippa, you have your hand up. Is it going to spawn 20 minutes of discussion? If not, go ahead.
I wanted to really support what Clara was just saying, because for me, when I was, establishing my career, the idea anyone would turn around and say you only got the job because you're a woman was kind of way out of field. It just didn't happen, and I was really shocked hearing earlier career colleagues saying that they were getting this kind of comment. It's just terrible that people can be so blinkered that they accuse people of that. It's partly, though, an issue of, in some countries there is an element of positive discrimination. If you take the most extreme example like South Africa, where they're really trying to correct a long-term bias, maybe that's okay, but that you do need to take care with these imposing of quotas, that you don't end up then totally undermining any minorities who get the position. I just put it in the chat, CERN also has one per year, a post-career break fellowship. It's not explicitly for a particular gender, but for people who've had a career break for caring reasons or health reasons or whatever. But really, again, the measure of that scheme is going to be whether the people that got those fellowships go on to get their next career position and their next career position. So those were just the comments I wanted to make.
Thanks, Pippa. So we have reached the end of the hour. I'd like to go back to the panel and give you guys one more chance. If you have any final words you wanted to share, it's okay if you don't have any. We could just move on to the next part of the plenary, which is a talk. But Would either of you, any of you three, like to finish with any words?
I'll just say there was a comment in the chat earlier on which was spot on. I think it's really good that that topics such as this are being given plenary space in major conferences. The numbers probably lower in the participants than you get for like the big showy award winner coming to talk, but still the fact there's 60 people here is really reassuring.
Okay.
Pardon. I think that one of the most important things to take away from this discussion is about allyship. To become a good ally for your colleagues, because there are things that you will have to ask them, their preferences, their needs, and understand their specific whatever assistance it is that they need to overcome the barriers and to be able to support them.
I think that's an excellent point, Giordon, and a good one on which to end the panel discussion. So I'd like to thank again Giordon, Clara, and Chris for joining. I think this has been really interesting and useful discussion. I'm really glad it was a plenary session as well. So thanks to everyone and for those in the audience who joined in. So because of time, I think we need to move straight on to the plenary talk in this session. There's just one, and that's from Pedro. Pedro, you are connected.
Hello.
I saw you earlier.
I'm here, yes. Although I feel guilty to come with a talk after this fantastic debate and because of the talk, having to shorten the debate.
Well, we look forward to your talk. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, so let me launch the. Now come back to Zoom, share the screen. I hope I can share it. I hope you see the screen.
Yep, we see your slides.
Okay, so I'll talk about public engagement in high-energy physics. Of course, one of the major points that we are also discussing within these groups is diversity, inclusion, and these problems. But let me tell you that actually, probably for me, the biggest challenge in reaching these groups are the ones with strong disabilities. Talking to deaf people or talking to blind people or people with different types of access disabilities are a huge challenge to go and try to get to them. So I'll talk about some example of a success case of outreach efforts in Portugal. Then I'll talk about general activities for general public. And I'll finish about how you can also contribute to the public engagement efforts. I want to stress all the time that public engagement does not exist without you. So we need you for this. The success case I want to speak about is the evolution of the threshold marks to enter Portuguese universities. Meaning that when students choose their higher education course, they want to study at universities, the students choose courses and they are selected on the threshold marks they get from high schools. And you see this evolution of these lines. Medicine is always one of the top choices for the best students in Portugal. In 2004, physics was rather low as a choice of students. But in 2005, we had the International Year of Physics, and which was celebrated all over the country, and this improved a little bit the situation. You have to look to this, I hope you see the mouse, to this thick line, the thick brown line. And the big difference started in 2007 when we involved with a teacher. I'll speak later on about this. So the evolution, the turnout of these efforts of trying to reach the students and society, the public at schools, teachers, families, and so on, is that finally in 2014, physics overcame medicine marks, and 2016, the top medicine marks. And now we are at level with the top choices, and the physics is among the top choices of students in the country. But the most important point is that all physics courses in Portugal, all vacancies are filled in the first application phase, meaning that the students are more interested in studying physics or physics engineering courses, and to proceed with these studies in our university. So yes, it does pay off to engage, to go to schools, to talk to students at all ages. For this, one of the very important roles is played by school teacher. It is the teacher that talks to the students. So if you convince a teacher that physics training is a very good higher education, then of course the teacher talks to the students, and this helps out in motivating the students to follow physics. CERN has understood this when it launched it in 1998, the International Teachers Programs, the high school teachers programs at CERN, and when in 2006 launched the National Teachers Programs. So far, there has been an impressive number of teachers at CERN that have followed one of such programs, more than 13,000 teachers. And in the national programs, the good point is that when CERN launched the national programs, we in Portugal profit immediately because there are some important advantages, namely for the fact that it is in the language of the teacher. So it solves one of the problems of the barriers from the teacher to ask questions in their native language is of course much easier. Then we get one important point is that we get many more opportunities per country. So because the teachers is for Portuguese teachers, we get 40 teachers at each of these programs. And the program also takes time from their formation time, from their training time, which is mandatory from the ministry, instead of taking time off the holidays or vacations time. And then they get credits awarded for their progression in the career. Now, in 2009, we opened the Portuguese teachers programs to teachers from different Portuguese-speaking countries. In 2009, Brazil and Mozambique, and since 2011, teachers from all Portuguese-speaking countries. For some time, we were able to reach teachers from all countries, and then later on, only with a lack of funding, again, we could not have teachers from African countries, except in 2019, we could have two teachers from Angola. So you see here that Portuguese-speaking teachers, there are already 723 that have been at CERN in one of these programs. And this has a strong effect on the students because then the students get to know of activities in particle physics, and it's much easier to engage the public if we get the students to participate in our activities. We got a strong increase in the Portuguese participation in the international master classes organized by IPOG. So this is one of the most filled days at University of Lisboa, more than 330 participants in a Saturday, so it's not a school day. They only come those that really want to participate. And this increase in participation is clearly due to the startup of the teachers programs in 2007. You see here the start of the growth following up the programs that we were preparing. So let me talk now about activities for the general public organized by IPOG and other networks. Let me first talk a little bit. There was a poster presentation by Stephen Goldfarb, IPOG co-chair. IPOG is the international scientific collaboration for education and outreach, involving researchers and experts in communication and education. We organize global activities, the international master classes in particle physics, and we have a portal, network of cosmic rays projects called Global Cosmics. We support local activities with funds that we set apart to be able to support the kickstart or kickoff of local activities. But one of the most important points in IPOG is that we get together twice a year to share expertise, best practices, to contribute resources to our resource database. We also collaborate with other networks doing communication or outreach, namely the European Particle Physics Communication Network based at CERN, but also the Astroparticle Physics European Consortium, Nuclear Physics, and iGrav dedicated to gravitational waves. The IPOG Global is a global network with 32 countries members, 6 international collaborations, 1 international laboratory being CERN, and 2 associate members, the national laboratories in German, GSI and DESI. IPO organizes the masterclasses based on the masterclass in particles developed in the UK, a model launched in 1997. And we took this model and we added up at the end of the day an international video conference discussing the results. So the difference to the UK model was to have this international link up, these international video conferences with participants that have in that day done the masterclass, the same masterclass measurement. We reach more than 14,000 students every year and about 60 countries and 220 research institutions. So here you get a glimpse of an image of the video conference of analyzing the real data and analyzed by the students on that day. And below is a map of the institutes participating, of the countries participating in the masterclass measurement. And happily, as everybody knows, 2020, as in many places, we had much smaller activity, about 25% of the normal sessions we could have in 2020. And in 2021, we had all masterclasses online only, which also could not have 300 participants, for example. These have much lower limits because of the support we have to provide to the students. The next point is, how can you get involved? Well, here are links to check if your institute participates, and if it does not, you can start, you can promote, you can go back to the institute and say, we would like to organize or to participate in an international masterclass program by organizing a masterclass day. You can organize an event on your own. We can help you to organize this. So to get started, there is this link here. You can be a moderator. So we are in strong need always of moderators for the masterclass video conferences. And we provide the training, and the moderation is done in pairs of 2-3 people, usually 2 people, and you have to do 2 to 3 shifts of moderations. And we try to guarantee that newcomers are paired with veterans. So your first moderation is not, well, you get help with your neighbor colleague. The next international program will start, well, we'll have one day on the 11th of February to celebrate the United Nations International Day for Women and Girls in Science. But we will have the International General Program starting on the 24th February and run until 9th of April 2022. But we're also discussing in IPOC how to improve masterclass program to other countries, especially in Africa, where we have very few countries participating in international masterclass program. We're trying to prepare masterclasses to open mode, namely that everybody that can join, to the general public, having the general public in mind. This will have to be online. We're trying to promote this. And we're also discussing how to prepare some international masterclasses for media professionals, which of course have to be tailored for that specific target. Related to the Global Cosmics Network, involving global cosmic ray projects, it's a network that supports cosmic rays at schools, projects at schools. DESI within this network organized the International Cosmic Day, and they had celebrated the 10th anniversary in last November. And QuarkNet at the United States celebrates the International Muon Week, and you have here a graph of the participation of institutes in this International Muon Week. There are several projects with cosmic rays with data available online. You can check them out at this website below. Now, of the other general activities to engage the public, of course, there are many types. Public sessions in conferences are always successful. Special dates or open days. CERN had its open days, and it was quite an event involving 90,000 visitors in 2 days. At pubs, like this activity of PhD students discussing their thesis or discussing physics in general with a beer of several types. In festivals, there are many ways to have public sessions. I want to highlight 4 public sessions that did, public engagement activities that were very successful in 2021, despite of COVID-19 in 2021. So one important one was happening in France, the celebration of the 50 years of IN2P3. So they had 14 public events receiving lots of visitors. There was a first science festival in Portugal, in Oeiras, and you can see here kids age 8 years old and 9 years old playing proton football in the CERN LHC interactive tunnel, or some people here getting passed through a cosmic ray detected in the LIPS portable spark chamber. And there is also, I want also to highlight this, let's say, mobile module that can travel in many places easily, and it's easy to engage the people playing games with the particle physics as the motus or the modus operandi. Of course, the European Researcher Nights is one night. It is usually the last Friday of September, although in 2020 it was the last Friday of November, in which we can engage the public. In 2020 it was online only. In 2021 there were already many places with in-presence celebration of these European Researcher Nights. For example, in Lisbon, we had these virtual visit. We were displaying here a virtual visit to the CMS experiment. We had there our spark chamber, and we are here talking to people. But please check also the Appscape poster by Miss Cavallari, in which this describes an escape room game using particle physics as the theme. Now, the largest or one of the most important public engagement activities happened at CERN on the 17th and 18th of September 2021, but was launched in November 2020, at the public launch in November 2020. So it's an event that is being prepared since more than 1 year. It's the SPARKS, the Serendipity Forum at CERN. So this is preparing 3 annual events leading to Science Gateway. Science Gateway will be CERN's flagship facility to engage the public and to try to answer the request for visits, which always overcome the capabilities of visits at the laboratory. So Science Gateway will hopefully be able to provide a better answer and receive more visits and receive them better, in a better way. Now, the first event of SPARKS was about future intelligence, and you can check the full recording of the public session in this at YouTube with this code, and you can check the slides presented by Claudia Marcelloni from CERN, which was the coordinator of the SPARKS forum. She presented all these activities at our IPOG 22nd IPOG meeting, so you can check on this timetable her presentation and the effects of her presentation. So how can you involve or get involved in public engagement? First, let me tell you that I think, I would like very much that everybody thinks it's one's duty. So I also think it's your duty to make sure that you engage the public. Most of us, we are paid by public funds, even if we are in university. Well, if you are in a public university, you are certainly paid by public funds. So we have the obligation to go back to the public and tell them what we are doing and the excitement of what we do. So you can, of course, organize or participate in public sessions, but also even if you are not invited to participate, you can try to be in the audience and then pose questions or try to intervene in the public session. You can also support it and communicate about it. Usually starts with your family, telling that there is this fantastic public session about this topic. There are, of course, the social media are a very good way to engage the public. There are very many networks. Even if you are not very fan of Instagram, you can try to prepare podcasts, for example, or just make a blog or tweet. You can also adhere and publicize the institutional channels like CERN or your university. You can, of course, also participate in science festivals or prepare exhibitions at different levels, either organizing them or participate in scientific advisory. again, supporting it, talking about it is also very helpful to get the public at the festivals and at exhibitions, or at the science pavilions in festivals, as those co-proposed by Connie Potter in many places. And you can also be a support scientist on those festivals. It's very difficult to have a science festival or a science pavilion at a festival without scientists there, because then somebody has to explain the science. And then when we ask for support, we desperately need volunteers to be able to join us. And if you want to find more contents and activities, you can always check the IPOG meetings, where we have many presentations about public engagement activities, and you can check also there the authors, the proper credits, the contacts, and so on. Now, we know that our field has very strong challenges ahead. The scale of the new projects, either the time span, which are decades, means that we have to now start talking to the children at a very young age. The cost means that they have to be global, and the size. We also need to improve the recognition of the value of fundamental science in society, especially nowadays in our field, that people start to feel that knowing that it's being discovered, there is nothing left to read, to search. We have to increase the reach of our activities. We have just a panel, fantastic panel about diversity, inclusion. That's something that we have to work around as well. We have to train the motivators, the tutors, the teachers. And we have to start introducing adiabatically or in a swift transition, particle physics in the school curricula, because there are many countries in which the teacher of physics or chemistry stops at the periodic table or the atom of the, well, early 20th century. Public engagement in education and outreach are more important than ever, and we need to maintain our presence in society and work on how the public perceive the scientific knowledge and the scientific process. So let me conclude that these are essential pillars for the development of high energy and particle physics. And I also thank very much the organizers to have this theme in the plenary session. We know that many scientists are already engaging the public in different venues and carry outwards the excitement of the field. But we all need your support and contribution, either being as an ambassador of the field, or a speaker, motivator, organizer, or evaluator of applications, positions, career assessment. Take positive the efforts of, for example, Clara Nellist on favor of diverse and minority representations. This should be evaluated very positively. And consider experience in outreach when evaluating people for new positions, new hires, etc. So we all count on you to help create the conditions for a better education, communication, and outreach in high energy physics. Thanks very much for your attention and to all people collaborating in these activities. Well, the number here is in English, sorry for that.
Thanks a lot, Pedro. Really interesting talk.
I hope I didn't went over time.
No, you were just fine.
Okay.
Do we have questions?
Well, let me back to the, probably if you want to join the master classes, write us.
Yep, we have to inspire the next generation and hopefully a representative sample of people. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. We can keep the session open for another minute or so. I think there's a short 20-minute coffee break about to start before the plenary sessions continue with some neutrino plenaries.
That's right.
So in that case, thanks, Pedro. Thanks to our panelists earlier in the session, and thanks to everybody from my personal perspective who gave parallel talks in these in this stream. So we will resume with a different chair in 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for having, again, for having this theme in such a fantastic conference.
Thank you, Mark, for chairing, and Pedro for this talk to the panelists earlier. I think this was a great session. Can only underline what you said to encourage everyone to engage in these outreach activities, although I suspect many people in this who are connected here are already doing so.
Are already converted.
But yeah, spread the word.
Oh,
And
yes.
see you in 19 minutes.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
share the session and get us started.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to start the neutrino plenary session. And we will start with the long baseline news, which will be given by.
I think I lost her. I hope it's okay if I start. Hello, my name is Kendall Mahn. I come to you from Michigan State University, and I'm delighted to talk to you about recent long baseline experiment results. So first, a word from our sponsors. I get generous support from the United States Department of Energy, and I'm really sad that I can't be there in person. I really, really appreciate the invitation to speak today, and hopefully we can make it to some Manchester in the future. So if you take away two big things from today's talk, these are the two things I want you to take away. Long baseline experiments are neutrino oscillation experiments that have broad scientific programs, and they give us really nice opportunities to test our understanding of the universe. And I hope I'll motivate for you today why the future is so bright for these experiments. There's exciting results I'll share with you today from the Tokai to Kamioka or T to K experiment, and from the NUMI off-axis NUI appearance or NOVA experiment. And these experiments are going to continue to run, so we have a lot to look forward to. So the reason we want to talk about this is, of course, because we're all excited about evidence for neutrino mass that come from neutrino oscillation experiments. And when we see this evidence, this inspires us to think about some new set of exciting questions that we want to answer. In particular, does neutrino oscillation give us windows on new physics, in particular CP violation with neutrinos? What is the neutrino mass ordering? And is our understanding complete? In particular, this exciting window opens up a new window on the universe that might have some other interesting things in it, like sterile neutrinos or non-unitarity of the mixing matrix. What evidence do we have for neutrino mass? I'm going to take a couple choice examples to help motivate the overall landscape of neutrino oscillation. And I'll start with electron neutrinos that come from the sun. So I'm just cherry picking one set of results here from the Sudbury neutrino oscillation experiment observatory. It gave results looking from neutrinos from the sun. And here they take charge current interactions where they're able to detect electron neutrinos by detecting electron in the final state. And they saw less than they expected, as shown here by this red line. Of course, when they took a look at the channel that measures all flavors, neutral current scattering, they noticed that this expectation did meet their prediction of total neutrinos from the sun. And so the conclusion here was that one, the solar model was correct, and two, that it appears that the rate from nu E has now converted into nu mu and nu tau flavors. And this is oscillation. And if you want to hear more about exciting solar results, there was a nice parallel talk on SNO plus results, and then also Borexino talk, see tomorrow's talk in the plenary. So that's one piece of observation that we have coming from solar experiments. We can also have terrestrial beam-based experiments where we take muon neutrinos that are produced from an accelerator. And here I'm taking as an example the KEK to Kamioka or K2K long baseline experiment. So here there's an accelerator located at KEK in one side of Japan, and they send a beam of neutrinos 250 kilometers to a far detector, Super Kamiokande. And what did K2K see? And K2K saw, instead of nu E disappearing into other flavors, this time for this energy, we see that muon neutrino flavors are now transitioning into other flavors. And this is a plot as a function of reconstructed energy of their event rate. And you see that their unoscillated spectrum in the dashed blue has now been distorted. It's shifted to the best fit, shown in the red, from their data. And what we know now is that oscillation depends upon the distance that those neutrinos traveled, as well as the energy we chose to use. Another example of accelerator-based oscillation experiments comes from the OPERA experiment. And so this takes a very high energy beam produced at CERN and sends it 732 kilometers over to Gran Sasso, an underground location that also has a series of emulsion plates. These emulsion plates are able to detect tau neutrinos. And what they see is that they see indeed an excess over the background that they attribute to tau neutrinos. We see new tau appearance from this beam. And that's what we'll call the appearance channel. So if we look at the totality of evidence from neutrino oscillation experiments, what we see is that we've got neutrinos from the sun, and antineutrinos from reactors. And if you're excited about hearing about these incredibly important results that underpin and provide important information for the results I'll show you today, I encourage you to take a look at the Juno parallel talk, as well as the plenary on Friday, looking forward. And then also, we also bring in information from not just accelerator-based experiments with muon neutrinos and antineutrinos, but also neutrinos that are produced in the atmosphere. And to hear about some of the latest results of that, also take a look at the plenary tomorrow by Spencer Klein. If I bring all of this information together, I believe I've got 3 neutrino flavors and 3 mass states, and these are related by, I believe, to be a unitary mixing matrix, the PM&S matrix. And assuming that it's unitary, it's got 3 mixing angles, theta 1, 2, theta 2, 3, and theta 1, 3. It's got a CP violating phase, delta CP. It also has 2 Majorana phases that I'm going to gloss over. These are not accessible by the oscillation experiments I'm going to focus on today. But if you're curious, do take a look at the wonderful effort in neutrinos double beta decay that tries to get at this physics. And that's in a plenary tomorrow. So what are the open questions? What would we like to answer? Well, first, I'd like to know if this CP violating phase is 0 or not. And in particular, we also might want to probe and understand it at some level. So if it's non-zero, to what precision can we understand it? We'd also like to make precision measurements of the other mixing angles. And this is to help motivate understanding of the entirety of the matrix, the unitarity of the matrix, but also because parameters like theta 2, 3, some of the least well-known currently, this one seems to be consistent with a special value of maximal mixing of pi over 2. So I want to know if it's maximal or not. And if it's not maximal, is it greater than or less than pi over 2? And that's a question of what is the octant. And then as I make these precision measurements, do I see a complete understanding emerges, or do neutrinos still have something exciting to tell us that we want to hear about? And to hear more about sort of the wonderful wide world out there of phenomenology and theory, I encourage you to take a look at tomorrow's plenaries. So the other thing that we're trying to probe in oscillation experiments is also to understand neutrino mass. So in neutrino oscillation experiments, we don't directly measure the mass. We measure the mass splitting. And we're able to measure from given 3 mass states, nu1, nu2, nu3, I'm going to measure 2 independent mass splittings, the difference here between 3 and 2, and the difference here between 1 and 2. Now I know that delta m squared, as defined here, 2, 1, is a positive quantity, and I know that from solar experiments. The other degree of freedom here is then delta m squared 3, 2 versus delta m squared, between m squared 3 and m squared 2. And I want to know if this is a positive quantity or not. That is to say, is m squared 3 larger or heavier or lighter than m squared 2? And maybe I would like to think that because this is mostly nu mu and nu tau flavor. And we know that the tau and the mu are heavier than the electron. But neutrinos don't have to behave like the other leptons necessarily. And it could be, and there is a possibility that in fact, instead of maybe a more normal or expected ordering to the mass hierarchy, instead, this mass is lighter than the other 2. And this would correspond to the inverted hierarchy. So an open question is, which of these 2 pictures do we live in? We hope to access details about this mixing matrix through long baseline experiments. And so let's walk through how that happens. This is the oscillation probability in its entirety, and you can see that it depends upon the mass splittings that we talked about, as well as the mixing angles that come in through these U elements. Now, if we consider the case where solar mixing is delta m squared is much smaller than atmospheric mixing, that is to say, this mass splitting, which is true and understood, then this whole situation simplifies. And if I just look at the disappearance probability from muon neutrinos to transition and oscillate into other flavors, then I get a relatively simple formula. Let's take a look at it in a little more detail. So typically in our experiments, we fix L and energy based on what we can access experimentally. So here, this is a plot that fixes this, assuming L is 295 kilometers, which will become relevant later. And indeed, this is an oscillatory behavior. It looks like oscillation. And so when I'm trying to do an oscillation experiment, I can probe the way that this well looks to probe the delta m squared mass splitting. And if I'm able to measure how much the rate changes, then I'm able to extract information about the mixing angles, and in this case, theta 2,3. I can also measure the appearance channel. And the important part about the appearance channel, and I'm not listing the probability, is because it's actually a very rich channel for us. It's sensitive to all oscillation parameters, including, and which means that I will be able to access information about CP violation and the mass hierarchy. The price I have to pay is that I do need to bring in key information about solar mixing as well as theta 1,3, and I can do this through precision measurements made at reactors and solar measurements. Let's get some intuition about how this oscillation probability looks. So I'm plotting that here, again, as a function of energy and fixed for a particular baseline. And what I see is that if I go from CP, no CP violation here, delta equals 0, and I go to pi over 2, I can decrease the rate. And if I go to minus pi over 2, I'm going to enhance the rate. And now if I look at the difference between the solid and the dash, I see that in each of these cases, as I move from normal to inverted hierarchy, I'm suppressing the rate. So I'm getting the largest rate for delta CP here at minus pi over 2 and normal hierarchy. If I look at the anti-neutrino oscillation channel, the probability to oscillate into anti-electron neutrinos, then I'm going to have an oscillation probability that looks like this. And now just comparing the red to the red, what I see is that I go from 0 to pi over 2, instead of decreasing as I do in the neutrino case, I'm increasing. So I have an anti-correlated effect in delta CP for neutrinos versus anti-neutrinos that I want to exploit by measuring both the neutrino channel and the anti-neutrino channel. So unfortunately, what I measure isn't this beautiful, perfect picture. I have to run an experiment that depends upon real event rates. And I infer my oscillation parameters from measuring event rates that depend upon the flux of neutrinos that I started with, how they interact, the cross-section, and how they interact, and I'm able to detect them in my detector, the detection efficiency. And so when I measure an event rate, I'm able, given a set of models for these things, extract an oscillation probability and set constraints. One other very key feature in oscillation experiments, especially long baseline experiments, is the use of near detector data. So if instead of waiting for my neutrinos to oscillate some very far distance away, I sit very close to production. And when I do this, the neutrinos haven't had a chance to oscillate. And this event rate then is highly correlated with my far detector event rate. It shares the same initial flux of neutrinos. It shares something about the interaction model. And in some experiments like NOVA, there's also some sharing of how the detector response looks. And these important shared characteristics significantly reduce our systematic uncertainties, and it's why typically long baseline experiments use multiple detectors. And one thing that I won't have a chance to talk about today, but it's worth noting is, indeed, these detectors, both the near and far detectors of these experiments, have a broad physics program that includes making measurements of neutrino interactions. So I won't talk about it today, but NOVA and TDK make measurements that can be useful for astrophysics searches, for other physics searches, or even for improving our own interaction model for future, current and future oscillation experiments. So that's the big picture. But now I'm going to narrow my focus to just talking about the two current long baseline experiments, TDK and NOVA. So TDK is an experiment also based in Japan, like KDK, where we have a particle beam sent from Tokaimura to a far detector in Kamioka. And the baseline here is 295 kilometers. And the NOVA experiment sends a beam from Fermilab all the way to the very top of Minnesota in Ash River, 810 kilometers. And there's been two very nice parallel talks that you heard about on Tuesday, and I encourage you to go look at the slides if you want to hear some more details about these wonderful experiments. Let's start with walking through some examples about how to run a long baseline experiment. And I'll draw examples from TDK and NOVA, starting with TDK, and starting with how we produce this intense accelerator-based beam. So in TDK, we use the J-Park facility. Here you can see the coastline of Japan. We use a 30 GeV proton beam that we then direct into the neutrino beam line. First, the protons strike a target. This produces unstable mesons, pions, and kaons. These are then directed towards a series of strong magnetic fields produced by what we call horns. These focus the pions collinear to the proton beam, where they then decay, producing a nice source of neutrinos. And here's what T decay's neutrinos look like as a function of energy. See, it's peaked at about 0.6 GeV. And one very nice feature of this setup is that unlike atmospheric neutrinos, we're really selecting flavor. When I say I want to produce a muon neutrino beam, I really meant it. I'm producing a pure muon neutrino flavor. And the nice thing is, because I'm doing that selection with these magnetic fields, I can flip the current of the horns, change the magnetic field, and I'm able to select, or the experiment is able to select, if I want to run with neutrinos or if I run with predominantly antineutrinos. And you see the fluxes are relatively similar, although there is some neutrino background in the antineutrino mode operation. A final really important feature is oscillation depends upon energy, and accelerator-based beams let us tune energy. And so here, this plot is going to show you a couple things. First, we have beam-based experiments with the T decay flux shown in purple as a function of energy, as well as nova, which is shown here in the green, peaked at about 2 GeV. So you're able to do oscillation physics with different baselines and different energies. And I'll tell you later that we're actually sensitive to enhancing or suppressing different effects. So there's nice complementarity in being able to run at different energies. And second, both T decay and nova are what we call off-axis beams. That is to say, what's actually sitting right in front of this proton beam is this gray flux. This is our on-axis near detector. I apologize, this is a mistake. And it's the Ingrid detector that lets us monitor the beam, where the T decay near detector and T decay far detector sit is actually 2.5 degrees relative to this beam direction. And that's another important feature that lets us have these very nice narrow peaked fluxes that we use. So the next key feature after we make this intense source is that I'm now going to send my beam of particles to a far detector. In this case, T decay's far detector is the Super Kamiokande 50 kiloton water Cherenkov detector. So here is an example of an opening up of what a muon neutrino would look like. And so for our energies, typically we've got a muon, we might have some pions in the final state, but I'm really going to tag that single Cherenkov ring. And from that Cherenkov ring, I can identify it as a muon or an electron. And further, I'm also able to extract information from the angle and the momentum that I can then use. So when I'm measuring an event rate, not just the overall rate, but really some information in momentum and angle that will let me constrain energy information as well. And nova uses a very different detection method. So here, sitting in Ash River is one of the largest freestanding plastic structures in the world. It's this huge detector that has a series of plastic structures that then are filled with scintillator and then read out. And events in this detector look like this. So this is an XY view. It's a tracking detector. You have the leptons with an enormous amount of energy. They're traveling meters through their detector, and really detailed and wonderful information about the final state particles and the hadronic shower. And so they're able to identify events via the track and characteristics of the track, straight tracks versus showers. And they're also able to identify neutral current events by just taking a look at different diffuse event topologies. So both events are able to select electron neutrinos and muon neutrinos and the antineutrino channels. So now I want to share with you how we interpret those results as oscillation. These results are the 2020 results from both experiments, and you can see that both experiments have run with neutrino enhanced beam or an antineutrino enhanced beam, and it's about 50-50% exposure for each. And I list the protons on target for each experiment here. Let's start with T decay. I'm just going to show you the muon neutrino event candidate in muon neutrino mode. Here's again this very striking oscillatory behavior. I'm going to extract theta 2,3 from how far down this dip goes, and I'm going to extract delta m squared from how this well looks. And from those two features, I'm going to extract an allowed region, delta m squared theta 2,3. And here you see this is the T decay result that gives you something that says it's consistent with a maximal mixing with the best fit, sitting slightly in the upper octant.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Here's the TDK the NOVA spectrum, just to give you a nice comparison. And I glossed over it, but TDK also fits the neutrino and the anti-neutrino samples. And this is important because both experiments also test whether or not you see a consistent picture between neutrinos and anti-neutrinos. As you can see visually from here, that there's quite good consistency with a consistent best fit. And NOVA then also sets an allowed region, shown here in red, in delta M squared 3.2 and theta 2.3. Now there's some other things on this plot. We also see the atmospheric results and the TDK results. And all of this shows that we see a really nice consistent picture between the beam and the atmospheric data sets. But I note that TDK and NOVA are statistics limited, so please watch this space as both of them continue to take data and reduce the size of their contours. Next, I want to talk to you about our appearance results. And this is maybe more of a technicality, but we actually analyze the disappearance channels and the appearance channels all together simultaneously. And that's important because to really understand NUI appearance, I need to have a constraint on theta 2.3 and delta M squared. So let's take a look at what NOVA sees. So NOVA does this really nice job of taking a look at these different subsamples where they have high purity and lower purity samples, as well as sideband information, to do a really nice job constraining their signal and their background. And you can also see that in general, in these long baseline experiments, you've got a huge pile of signal sitting on a rather modest background. So in general, these experiments have excellent signal to background separation. And if we interpret these event rates in neutrinos and antineutrinos now as a measurement of delta CP, you see that the best fit is down here, where they're favoring delta CP in the normal ordering and theta 2.3 in the upper octant, and that there's some regions of exclusion here for the upper octant inverted hierarchy. Now let's take a look at TDK. So here's the TDK event rates, and broadly speaking, the neutrino data sets have an enhancement and the antineutrino data sets have a deficit. And as a result, TDK instead would very much favor maximal CP violation for the normal ordering. If I project this result onto delta CP theta 2.3 space, and I overlay it, the TDK results here favoring maximal mixing, and NOVA results favoring instead not necessarily maximal CP violation, you see that this is a bit striking because the best fits sit maybe outside of each other's allowed regions. But the point of this, when I look at this, is that although this is maybe sort of at first blush an exciting picture, both experiments have significant regions of overlap with each other. Especially if I look outside the normal hierarchy into the inverted ordering, you immediately see overlap. The big takeaway is that both of these experiments are still running. Again, more statistics will help us really understand this very rapidly changing landscape. And to give you a sense of how these two experiments end up being complementary, if I just talk about the size of the CP effect and matter effect on TDK, we see that TDK is, to first order is mostly CP effect with some matter effect, and NOVA includes both in sort of almost equal proportion, but a little bit more on the matter effect side. So one of the exciting things that we're going to see in the next chunk of time is that there's going to be combined analyses of TDK and NOVA, and also TDK and super K. And I think that this will also really help us clarify the current experimental picture. So as I mentioned, the two experiments plan to continue running through about 2026. And both experiments are also making great strides. In addition to being able to take extra data, they also want to make improvements to their analysis. And in TDK's case, we're doping the FAR detector with gadolinium. We're also including a new set of near detectors and upgrading the beamline. And NOVA also has a dedicated campaign of improving systematics too, using information from the test beam program. So I want to conclude today on one more fun window in the broad physics program of long baseline oscillation, and that's searches for exotic physics. And so here we've got an intense neutrino source, multiple detectors, so we're able to do physics like sterile neutrino physics, neutral heavy lepton searches, Lorentz violation, extra dimensions. And here a key player isn't TDK and NOVA, but the MINOS Plus experiment that ran has got a lot of really nice measurements along these lines. These results are highly complementary to the work that you're going to hear about in the talk right after mine and some of the really nice stuff that Microboon is doing. So let's briefly talk about sterile neutrinos with NOVA. Here's their neutral current event rate. This is a sterile neutrino search at their FAR detector, where they're measuring with their anti-neutrino beam a rate that appears consistent with expectation, indicating no mixing into sterile neutrinos. We could also use this intense beamline to test for a hypothesis of what if these kaons decayed instead not to neutrinos, but maybe they decayed to a heavier neutral lepton. And then that heavy neutral lepton would leave signatures in our large volume, low mass TPCs. And from that, we're able to set a limit on the coupling of these large heavy neutral leptons to muons and electrons. And this plot was made before the really nice results that I heard about yesterday, which give limits from a dedicated experiment, NA62. And I expect that Microboon is also going to add to this picture. So it's exciting to see that we're seeing a confluence of complementary information and searches all producing results. So to conclude, long baseline experiments are broad scientific programs that give us opportunities to understand our universe in more detail. These experiments really go after understanding the mass hierarchy, CP violation, as well as details of precision measurements of theta 2-3. And these experiments are able to also contribute meaningfully to exotic physics programs, as well as neutrino interaction physics. And I'm excited about the future. TDK and NOVA are statistics limited. Both are going to run. It'll be really fun to see what those results come up with and their final results in order 2026. And we're going to see in the near term combined analyses of NOVA, TDK, and SuperK data sets to really exploit some of this complementary information of the experiments. And then beyond that, please listen to the talks on Friday about future experiments. TDK, Dune, and HyperK are really going to make the nice precision measurements that we need to see. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Kendall, for the complete overview. So please, we have some time for questions. Yes. Yes, Marco.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk, Kendall. Could you go back a couple of slides where you mentioned the new NA62 results, and could you just sort of wave your hands to indicate where those come in?
Oh yeah, it's hard to say. I think that they may just be squeaking out ahead of us. It was a little tough just for me to see on the plot relative to grossly, they follow the T-decay curve. So it's in this region, and I think they or us will try to prepare updated overlays. But it's quite exciting. I mean, when I was talking to the speaker yesterday, he was also like, oh, this is great. We're seeing really like the same information from a very different place. I mean, one of the trickier things for this is, you know, you're having to rely on more of a chain, whereas they're doing this more directly with the kaon decay.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Now, David.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a very nice talk. I was curious about the upgrades to the T2K near detector. What do those look like?
Yeah, I apologize. I probably should have put a more detailed backup. In short, so maybe just look at my hands. We have a scintillator bar tracking detector that's 2D, much like NOVA. And what we're going to do is now use a series of cubes and also have better TPC coverage surrounding it. So we're going to get sort of more uniform acceptance at the near detector. And this will be very helpful as we're really trying to probe new classes of interaction model systematics. So that's the fast answer to our near detector. There's another thing I glossed over, which is that we actually have new sets of detectors in the beam at different off-axis positions. There's also the Wagashi baby mine detector. That's a really neat scintillator detector filled with water, and then also surrounded with magnetized detectors to be able to measure information at a slightly different off-axis angle that will also contribute to our understanding of interaction model systematics. Historically, that's something that's been very important to the TDK program, so these new detectors will really help with that. And there's actually a really nice TDR. I'll update my slides with a link to that so that you can have it as well as the beamline.
Cool, thanks, very exciting.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I don't see any more questions, so we can move in time to the following talk, which will be given by David Caratelli from Santa Barbara. And now we will hear about short baseline experiment. Please go ahead. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thanks for the pointer. So I was saying, thanks for this opportunity. I'm really sorry we're not meeting in person, but I'd like to thank the organizers for arranging for the conference to take place nonetheless, and in particular for accommodating time zones all the way out to the West Coast. That's very much appreciated. So I'm here to talk about short baseline neutrino experiments. And I'm benefiting from a very nice overview of oscillation measurements by Kendall. So let me just kind of bring that into the context of what I'll be discussing. When we're making oscillation measurements, we really care a lot about two observables, the baseline, the distance the neutrino has traveled, and its energy. And these allow us to then probe fundamental parameters about neutrino mixing. In kind of the oscillations between three neutrinos that we've heard about in the previous talk, this generally kind of sets a scale for what baselines and energies we're looking at in order to probe the fraction of an electron volt mass splittings between the three active neutrinos. For short baselines, essentially, we're doing, in some sense, the same thing, but at much shorter baselines, hence the name. And we're in a regime where experiments are not probing mass splittings of a fraction of an electron volt, but really on the order of 1 electron volt. And anomalies in short baseline experiments have spurred interest into the idea of electron volt scale sterile neutrinos. So short baseline, in this context at least, really means neutrino experiments that are probing a mass splitting of the order 1 eV. What are these short baseline experiments? Well, they actually come in many different kinds, using many different sources and detector technologies. We have experiments conducted at accelerators using nuclear reactors as their neutrino source, and radiological sources. And again, these are different energies and different baselines, but all in all, they're kind of have this common feature of probing the same L over E, which is so important in in probing that mixing matrix. So when performing neutrino oscillations, ideally we're in a situation in which we have a near detector and a far detector. The near detector serves as a control sample and it measures the unoscillated flux and constrains systematics for the far detector so that we can make these very nice ratio plots. And here I have an example from the Minos experiment where essentially many systematics cancel out and we use the ratio to map out the oscillation parameters. For the short baseline neutrino anomalies that I briefly mentioned, we're in a bit more complicated of a situation because of the nature of how these anomalies came up or how the experiments were designed. We don't really have near detectors to constrain these systematics. And so we suffer from larger uncertainties on the predicted neutrino rate. And this comes in two kinds, really, uncertainties on the flux of the neutrinos and systematics on the neutrino cross sections, which both boil down to nuclear physics, basically modeling of nuclear physics processes. So this means that when we're kind of making observations here, we're suffering from slightly larger systematic uncertainties. And what this means is that kind of the interpretation of these anomalies is necessarily a bit more complicated. And this is one of many examples of joint fits that try to take data from multiple experiments into account to get a sense for what these anomalies mean in the context of electron volt sterile neutrinos. And you can see in this particular analysis, kind of a conflicting picture coming from some appearance experiments, which seem to prefer this hypothesis of a new neutrino with a mass splitting of the order 1 electron volt, compared to experiments that perform disappearance measurements, which instead seem to rule out, and at least our intention with that claim. So it's a somewhat unclear picture. And while this is a short baseline experiment talk, I think it's very important to credit the important contributions to these physics searches that come from long baseline experiments. And you heard this mentioned briefly from Kendall. So this is the accelerator neutrino long baseline program and beyond, making important measurements in clever ways that can contribute to understanding this picture. And from these measurements, which often come in the form of disappearance measurements, is where lots of this tension to the electron volt sterile neutrino hypothesis comes in. So after that brief introduction, what's new from short baseline experiments? There's actually many recent results which tie directly to this question of short baseline anomalies. And I think you'll find that in this talk, I've taken the liberty to really highlight one of these results, which is from the microboon experiment. I do so because not only am I a collaborator in the microboon experiment, but this is really a highly anticipated result, which came out just a few months ago and has been about 10 years in the making. So I've chosen to try and highlight it in a bit more detail. And over the next few slides, I'll be basically presenting this new analysis and its results. So first, some background on the anomaly amongst these short baseline anomalies that microboon is testing. This is a result from the mini-boon collaboration, which essentially saw an excess of neutrino interactions in its data set, which have the feature of being having electromagnetic activity in the visible topology in the detector. Mini-boon is a Cherenkov detector, and because of this, cannot really separate the signature of a single electron from a single photon. So while this result is really quite significant, it's a kind of more than 4 sigma excess, we can't distinguish between electrons and photons, and this leads to kind of a more puzzling interpretation of what this really is due to. And when you interpret this as an excess of electron neutrinos, you can start thinking about what this might mean for EV scale stereo neutrino models. And so that's exactly what the mini-boon collaboration does. They take a look at what this means in the context of an electron volt scale stereo neutrino interpretation. And you see that, again, it gives this picture with kind of order EV scale mass splittings preferred. So mini-boon's result is a key motivation for EV scale stereo neutrino searches, but this motivation arises from the interpretation of the excess as extra oscillated electron neutrinos. And that's where microboon comes in. Microboon is an experiment that was designed to test this interpretation. And the way it does so is by leveraging the liquid argon technology to differentiate between electrons and photons. So let's talk just a second about the neutrinos that we're dealing with. These experiments sit on the booster neutrino beamline at Fermilab. It's a roughly GeV scale neutrino beam, and it's almost entirely made up of muon neutrinos, which is convenient when we're trying to look for basically a possible appearance of the very small intrinsic contamination of electron neutrinos. It sits at a baseline of about 400 meters from the beam, and to give a sense of rates, microboon observes about 1 neutrino interaction per minute. Okay, so what do we do with these neutrinos? We use the liquid argon technology to produce, TPC technology to produce beautiful detailed images such as this one. Here you're seeing a charge current neutrino interaction producing a nice long muon and lots of hadronic activity that can be studied in detail thanks to the imaging capabilities of this detector. And I'll take a moment to highlight several contributions in this conference on results from microboon from its low energy access search, cross-section program, and beyond the standard model program that you can find at the links below. Okay, so we take these pictures, and as I said before, we use them in this key idea of separating electrons and photons, and you can see a demonstration of that in the plot on the top right here, showing with our own data how we can differentiate calorimetrically electron showers from photon showers based on their energy loss profiles. So what we do with this ability is basically try to see how we can address the nature of the mini-boon excess. And what we've done in the first rounds of analyses that were released just a few months ago is investigate 2 specific hypotheses for the source of the excess. The first hypothesis we've investigated is whether this excess could be contributed from one of the key backgrounds in mini-boon, which is from delta radiative decay to single photons, a standard model process. The other investigation is whether this excess could be due to electron neutrinos. And these are both leading hypotheses for the source of the anomaly and the target of our first round of results. So let's start with the first, the hypothesis that this might be photons from this NC delta to single photon standard model process. This is a background that's been looked in with some scrutiny, and in part because it's of the backgrounds from mini-boon, the one that is not really constrained with their own data. So the question is it responsible for mini-boon's excess? Microboon has performed a search for this topology, looking at events with a single photon consistent with the delta radiative kinematics, both with and without protons in the final state. And this is a summary of our results. You see the prediction in the dashed line when we expect the mini-boon excess to be interpreted as an excess of NC delta radiative events, and the black line predicting what we'd expect if that were not the case. And you see that our data point is consistent with this latter hypothesis. So quantitatively, what we find is that the hypothesis that the mini-boon excess is due to this process is disfavored at the roughly 95% confidence level. Okay, so now let's move on to the second hypothesis, the hypothesis that the excess is from electroneutrinos. So again, mini-boon was conceived to search for EV-CL neutrinos, in fact, as a follow-up of a previous experiment, LSND. The electron-like nature of the excess would support the hypothesis that mini-boon saw appearance of electroneutrinos in a muon-neutrino beam. And microboon, with its detector technology, can test this hypothesis by searching for electroneutrinos in the same beamline. And the results that I'll be highlighting are really summarizing 4 publications with many more supporting those, which you can find references for here. So the way we've carried out this analysis is actually to develop 3 independent and blind analyses, which look at different final state interactions to final state interaction categories to reconstruct electroneutrinos and measure electroneutrinos. And we do so, these 3 analyses using 3 different reconstruction techniques. We do so to kind of fully leverage the LARTPC technology, but also to help develop it with new advances in pattern recognition. And we look at different final states for 2 reasons. One is different final states might highlight different types of interaction modes from neutrino cross sections and different types of final state interactions coming within the nucleus, as well as the fact that new physics may lurk in different channels. And so it's important to be able to explore a broad range of final state topologies. So again, unfortunately, I don't have too much time to go into lots of detail, which you can find in the talk from Nick that I referenced before. But here's a summary of the results from the 3 different analyses. What you see are the predictions for the electron-neutrino spectra and the data on top of that, with the dashed curves representing our interpretation of, or one interpretation of the mini-boon excess if it were due to electroneutrinos. And the thing I'll highlight in this slide is that these are by large, very pure selections of electroneutrinos. So microboon, because of its electron-photon separation power, can really key in on electroneutrinos and measure them in a pure way, unlike was possible for mini-boon. If I try to summarize the results all at once, what we find is that our results do not indicate an excess of electroneutrinos in our data. And it's important to stress that this is consistent across the 3 analyses, and the confidence level of the strength of this claim varies analysis by analysis from order 97% to a little over 3 sigma. You can see the results summarized in this plot, which shows the ratio between the observation in our signal region compared to the prediction under the hypothesis of no excess of electroneutrinos in gray, with the red denoting what we might expect that excess to look like. And you can see that in particular in the channels with significant sensitivity to this excess, in fact, what we see is maybe a little bit of a deficit of our compared to our electroneutrino prediction. But all in all, what we find is at the kind of 97 to 3 sigma confidence level, no excess of electroneutrinos. Beyond the analysis results themselves, there's a whole bunch of work that really has been years in the making, and I'll just give some highlights. One key aspect of these analyses is that they are producing data-driven background constraints through multiple different channels, looking at muon neutrinos, which come in high statistics from the beam, neutral current processes, and a whole suite of sideband measurements, which are used to validate the analysis before unblinding. Beyond the context of the analyses themselves, we're leveraging really years of development within microboon and the broader liquid argon community. And these come in the form, in particular, of multiple rounds of cross-section measurements from our own collaboration, making measurements of neutrino cross-sections in different final states, which are in part used to improve our modeling of neutrino interactions for this analysis as well. And many years of analysis development, meaning reconstruction techniques and calibration methods that have really enabled and transformed the liquid argon PPC technology into one that can deliver precision physics. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about what comes next for microBoost. So what we've done so far is found no excess of events in the two channels we've probed, which are the delta radiative standard model process and the electron-neutrino hypothesis. What's yet to come is a very exciting continued program of physics from microBoost. We have half of our data yet to analyze. We're taking more inclusive looks at some of the channels that might help address the mini-Boone anomaly, including a more inclusive look at photon processes. And we're starting to test more models than the ones that we use as benchmarks for this first round of results. For example, 3+1 oscillation models. And beyond this, we really have a rich program of beyond the standard model searches that make use of both the booster neutrino beamline, which I mentioned, and the NUMI beamline, of which microBoost sits off axis with respect to. And just to give a sense for these capabilities, I'm highlighting here two of the publications from microBoost looking for BSM physics. On the left is a recent Higgs Porter scalar search from last year, and in the center is our first heavy neutral lepton search with our data. And these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg for what's to come in the months and years ahead from the collaboration. And I'll also point you to a talk by Pedro Machado tomorrow on neutrino phenomenology that both ties to kind of what microBoost results mean for the mini-Boone axis and what are the broader opportunities for BSM physics with this type of detector. One other topic I wanted to highlight is what comes beyond microBoost at short baselines at Fermilab, and that's the short baseline neutrino program. So this is a suite of 3 detectors. microBoost has already collected 5 years worth of data, and it's now joined by the Icarus and SBND detectors. Icarus is a massive liquid argon detector, kind of 600 tons of argon, sitting 600 meters from the booster beamline, and SBND acts as a near detector at about 100 meters from the booster beamline. The suite of these detectors allows to enhance the physics output of this program. For example, we now go back to this idea of having both a near detector and a far detector to really properly probe EV scale sterile neutrinos with small systematics. This also leads to a very rich program of neutrino argon cross-section measurements, in particular thanks to the really high flux that the short baseline detector will see, that SBND will see. And as I mentioned, there's really an expanding landscape for beyond the standard model searches, which all 3 of these detectors are keen on pursuing. And what I'll do here is, for more detail, highlight a talk from Nicola on the status of the short baseline near detector. So the near detector of these 3, which was presented previously at this conference, and you can find a link to in this slide. Okay, so I said I was going to be fairly heavily leaning on microBoost. Let me, however, give a brief update on the status of short baseline measurements from reactors and the gallium anomaly. So let's start with reactors. The reactor anomaly is an overall normalization discrepancy between the expected and predicted rate of neutrinos from nuclear reactors. And these kind of these often operated at the kilometer scale baseline. This discrepancy has led to a flurry of new measurements at order meter baselines, which can probe this anomaly as a proper oscillation measurement. So this really has led to a broadening landscape of experiments, which, because they sit at much shorter baselines, can, within their own detector volume, look at L over E dependence of the neutrino rate, and therefore perform a flux model independent measurement of and test of sterile neutrino hypothesis. And I'm listing here some of the key players in this game, which are distributed all over the world. And again, as a key leverage, the fact that they are now placing their detectors at just meters from the reactor core in order to study the full features of possible oscillations. In addition to the experimental side, there's also been updates on the kind of calculation side of the reactor flux, which again is a key player in kind of making claims based on these observations. And I'll point you to this paper, which includes a new reactor flux calculation, which seems to alleviate the tension that was previously reported and led to this so-called reactor-based reactor anomaly. And I'm also pointing to some reanalyses based on these flux in the context of EV scale sterile neutrinos. Okay, the last item I want to mention is the gallium anomaly. So this is a deficit of electron neutrinos from the gallium detectors SAGE and GALEX. These are solar neutrino measurements that used intense radioactive sources, in some senses calibration tools. They, however, noticed a deficit of neutrinos compared to what they predicted from calculations of the cross-section for these very low energy processes. So what's new on this front? Actually, there's really nice results from the BEST experiment, and the name is quite indicative of the quality. These results are basically trying to put this gallium anomaly to the test. And the way they improve on the past observations is by basically splitting the detector into two volumes. And by doing so, essentially also starting to probe multiple, or at least two different baselines, and therefore trying to get a sense for whether this signal is due to an oscillation or not. And so what the BEST experiment does is measure the measure the observed rate of neutrinos from chromium source and compare it to its calculated prediction in these two different volumes. And what they find is, indeed, they find a deficit confirming the gallium anomaly, and they do so actually with more statistical, with better precision compared to past experiments. They also, when fitting their data to the EVs to 3+1 model, find best fits that are at slightly more than the electron volt scale. At the same time, however, the ratio of the observed to predicted rate in these two different volumes is fairly consistent, which is therefore not pointing to a clear baseline dependent modulation in the neutrino rate, which you would expect maybe from, depending on the mass splitting for the neutrino oscillation. Okay, so let me summarize briefly what I discussed. So microboon's first results addressing the mini-boon anomaly are out. We find no excess in the electron neutrino channel or this NC delta radiative standard model process. And these are claims that we're able to make at this point at the kind of 95 to 3 sigma range. We still have half of our data yet to analyze and a growing physics program exploring BSM models, cross-sections, and so on. On the reactor side, there's many order meter scale experiments which are probing the anomaly in a model independent way. And there's updates to flux models for reactor neutrino fluxes, which seems to be reducing the tension that led to this anomaly. On the gallium side, the BEST experiment recently released results. These confirm the deficit, but show no L dependence, at least within the two volumes that were studied. And finally, just to summarize it all, short baseline neutrino experiments, there's lots of them. They're addressing past anomalies, but have also expanded in scope, developing a broad and active neutrino and beyond physics program. And I think that's it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Kendall, first question.
So this may or may not be something that you have domain expertise on, but I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the prospects for, how is there a loophole in how the reactor, I'd always understood that the reactor anomaly and gallium anomaly are sort of measuring the same thing, anomalous Nui bar disappearance. So how do we reconcile, say, recent prospect experiment results with the gallium anomaly? Can you talk about where you see what's needed to sort of resolve those 2 points of tension as well?
Sure. So I guess I do see, so the 3 anomalies have this common L over E feature, but I at least personally see them as kind of independent in some sense. So on the reactor side, it's a matter of understanding the reactor fluxes and all the modeling that goes into that. And on the gallium side, maybe it's questions on kind of the cross-section calculations, which are fairly complex because of the processes involved that lead to the predicted rate. So at least, yeah, I'm by far from the expert here, but at least my sense is that they can have different origins which don't necessarily need to be tied to stereo neutrino interpretation because of the different nuclear physics modeling that essentially leads to systematic uncertainties in both.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think the part that I was getting tripped up on was I hadn't appreciated for BEST that they were doing some kind of relative measurement that is between 2 volumes. And I was trying to reconcile that with if you have some cross-section mismodeling, I would have assumed naively it would cancel. And so that was what I found interesting there.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So maybe, yeah, at least my reading of this is that, yes, there's a deficit, but it could be, I mean, the fact that it's the same deficit at these 2 different baselines is could at least can't exclude the idea that maybe it's a cross-section process that needs updated calculation.
Ah, I get it now. Thank you. That was very helpful.
You mentioned that there are 2 systematics which short baseline experiment have to deal with, and they are both related to nuclear effects. With this new results, which one you consider most important or the one which needs to be attacked most?
So I mentioned this. Oh, so that, well, I think the main line of attack should continue to be having near and far detector measurements that can allow these systematics to cancel out in the ratio. Or a single detector that can probe different baselines within its own volume, such as what's happening at reactors. Having said that, I would say that, well, I don't know if I can really pick one of the 2. They're both important. They're both kind of in their own nature, at least in the accelerator program, contributing on similar scales, I'd say, at least to first order. And so they really need to be tackled simultaneously through these near detector measurements. I will say that I think there is a really strong emphasis from many of the experiments operating, at least at accelerators, to perform really extensive cross-section measurements, which help inform us on cross-section modeling and reducing systematics there. And maybe it's good to kind of make sure we keep focused also on making sure we understand our fluxes. And there are efforts here, but maybe they're kind of coming up in the near future, such as I'm aware of the emphatic project and others. But yeah, so maybe I'd say it's important to try and keep a focus on both, and therefore also not forget the modeling of the flux as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If not, then I would like to thank both speakers for excellent presentation. And we came to the end of the session.
Thank you very
Mark,
much.
do you have any?
Thanks to you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.